Okay. I want to see how Roland and Jake and Susanna and Eddie and the little bumper are doing. The story just rambles on. There's hardly any sections to it. So, Roland's telling the story about how him and his con-mate long ago when they were boys, forget his con-mate's name, but we'll find out later. They are at the lady's place, the Sisters of Serenity, like past the Borderlands or whatever, just past it. And the headmistress there is Eveline, and this girl, they're looking for the Skin Man, the shapeshifter, shape changer. It's literally tearing people apart and eating them, pieces of them, leaving other pieces of them. It's funny. So yeah, Fortuna's all tore up from this thing, and Dolores was with her. She's telling the story. They're going to get water, and Dolores ain't here no more, and Fortuna's all mangled, so mangled. So they're all sitting there. I think they're getting ready to eat. They're at the table, and Fortuna's talking, and she told the story. Said, I turned to flee. It caught me, and I remember no more. I do, Everline said grimly. I heard the screams and came running out with our gun. It's a great long thing with the bell at the end of the barrel. It's been loaded since time out of mind, but none of us has ever fired it. For all I knew, it could have blown up in my hands. But I saw it tearing at poor Forty's face, and then something else, too. When I did, I never thought of the risk. I never even thought that I might kill her, poor thing, as well as it, should the gun fire. I wish you had killed me, said Fortuna. Oh, I wish you had. She sat in one of the chairs that had been brought to the table, put her face in her hands, and began to weep. Her one remaining eye did, at least. Never say so, Everline told her, and stroked her hair on the side of her head, not covered by the bandagement, for 'tis blasphemy. Yeah, well. Did you hit it? I asked. A little, Eveline replied. Our old gun fires shot, and one of the pellets, or perhaps more than one, tore away some of the knobs and scales on its head. Black tarry stuff flew up. We saw it later on the cobbles, and sanded it over without touching it, for fear it might poison us right through our skin. The charry thing dropped her, and I think it had almost made up its mind to come for me. So I pointed the gun at it, though a gun like that can only be fired once. Then must be recharged down its throat with powder and shot. I told it to come on. Told it I'd wait until it was good and close, so the shot wouldn't spread. She hawked back and spat into the dust. It must have a brain of some sort even when it's out of its human shape, because it heard me and ran. But before I lost sight of it around the wall, it turned and looked back at me, as if marking me. Well, let it. I have no more shot for the gun, and won't unless the traitor happens to have some, but I have this. She lifted her skirts to her knee, and we saw a butcher's knife in a rawhide scabbard strapped to the outside of her calf. So let it come for Everline, daughter of Rosanna. You said you saw something else, I said. She considered me with her bright black eyes, then turned to the women. Clemmy, Brianna, serve out. Fortuna, you will say grace, and be sure to ask God forgiveness for your blasphemy, and thank him that your heart still beats. Oh, because she said she wanted to die. Oh. Everline grasped me above the elbow, drew me through the gate, and walked me to the well where the unfortunate Fortuna had been attacked. There we were alone. I saw its prick, she said in a low voice, long and curved like a cyameter, twitching and full of the black stuff that serves for blood. Serves it for blood in that shape, Benny Rowe. It meant to kill her as it had Dolores, right enough. Yeah, it's just young Roland and Everline. Everline's talking. It meant to kill her as it had Dolores, right enough. But it meant to fuck her too. It meant to fuck her as she died. Ew. Stephen King. Gruesome. Jamie and I ate with them. Fortuna even ate a little, and then we mounted up for town. Jamie, that's his coming. But before we left, Everline stood by my horse and spoke to me again. When your business here is done, come and see me again. I have something for you. What might that be, say? She shook her head. Now is not the time. But when that filthy thing is dead, come here. She took my hand, raised it to her lips, and kissed it. I know who you are, for does your mother not live in your face? Come to me, Roland, son of Gabrielle. Fail not. Then she stepped away before I could say another word, and glided in through the gate. The Debaria High Street was wide and paved, although the pavement was crumbling away to the hard pan beneath in many places, and would be entirely gone before too many years passed. There was a good deal of commerce, and judging from the sound coming from the saloons, they were doing a fine business. We only saw a few horses and mules tied to the hitching post, though, in that part of the world. Livestock was for trading and eating, not for riding. A woman coming out of the mercantile, with a basket over her arm, saw us and stared. She ran back in, and several more people came out. By the time we reached the High Sheriff's office, a little wooden building attached to the much larger stone-built town hall, the streets were lined with spectators on both sides. Have you come to kill the Skin Man? The lady with the basket called. Those two don't look old enough to kill a bottle of rye, the man standing in front of the Cherry Fellows Saloon and Cafe called back. There was a general laughter and murmurs of agreement at this sally. Town looks busy enough now, Jamie said, dismounting and looking back at the 40 or 50 men and women who'd come away from their business and their pleasure to have a gleep at us. It'll be different after sundown, I said. That's when such creatures as the Skin Man do their marauding, or so Benet says. We went into the office. Hugh Peavy was a big-bellied man with long white hair and a droopy mustache. His face was deeply lined and careworn. He saw our guns and looked relieved. He noted our beardless faces and looked less so. He wiped off the nib of the pen he had been writing with, stood up, and held out his hand. No forehead knocking for this fellow. Oh, so I... After we'd shaken with him and introduced ourselves, he said, I don't mean to belittle you, young fellows, but I was hoping to see Stephen Deschain himself, and perhaps Peter McVrees. "McVrees died 3 years ago," I said. Peavy looked shocked. "Do you say so? For he was a trig hand with a gun, very trig. He died of a fever, very likely induced by poison, but this was nothing the High Sheriff of the DeBarria Outers needed to know. As for Stephen, he's otherwise occupied, and so he sent me. I am his son. Yar, yar, I've heard your name and a bit of your exploits in Meegees, for we get some news even out here. There's the dit-dat wire, and even a jing-jang." He pointed to a contraption on the wall. Written on the brick beneath it was a sign reading, "Do not touch without permission." I used to go all the way to Gilead, but these days only to Sallywood in the south, the Jefferson spread to the north, and the village in the foothills. Little DeBarria it's called. We even have a few street lamps that still work, not gas or kerosene, but real spark lights. Don't you see? Townfolk think such'll keep the creature away. He sighed. I am less confident. This is a bad business, young fellows. Sometimes I feel the world has come loose of its moorings. Reminds me of a poem, too. It has, I said, but what comes loose can be tied tight again, Sheriff. If you say so. He cleared his throat. Now, don't take this as disrespect. I know ye are who ye say ye are, but I was promised a sigil. Sigil. Spell down. Sigil. If you brought it, I'd have it, for it means special to me. I opened my swag bag and brought out what I'd been given, a small wooden box with my father's mark, the D with the S inside of it, stamped on the hinge lid. Peavy took it with the smallest of smiles, dimpling the corners of his mouth beneath his mustache. To me it looked like a remembering smile, and it took years off his face. Do we know what's inside? He asked me. No, I had not been asked to look. Peavy opened the box, looked within, then returned his gaze to Jamie and me. Once, when I was still only a deputy, Stephen Deschain led me, and the High Sheriff that was, and a posse of 7 against the Crow gang. Has your father ever spoken to you of the Crows? I shook my head. Well, not skin men, no, but a nasty lot of work, all the same. They robbed what there was to rob, not just in DeBarria, but all along the ranch lands out this way. Trains, too, if they got word one was worth stopping. But their main business was kidnapping for ransom. A coward's crime, sure. I'm told Farson favors it, but it paid well. Your da showed up in town only a day after they stole a rancher's wife, Belinda Doolin. Her husband called on the jing-jang as soon as they left, and he was able to get himself untied. The Crows didn't know about the jing-jang, and that was their undoing. Of course, it helped that there was a gunslinger doing his rounds in this part of the world. In those days, they had a knack of turning up when and where they were needed. He eyed us. Perhaps they still do. Anyhow, we got out to the ranch while the crime was still fresh. There were places where any of us would have lost the trail. It's mostly hardpan out north of here, don't you see? But your father had eyes like you wouldn't believe. Hawks ain't even in it. Deer. Or eagles, either. I knew of my father's sharp eyes and gift for trailing. I also knew that this story probably had nothing to do with our business, and I should have told him to move along. But my father never talked about his younger days, and I wanted to hear this tale. I was hungry to hear it. And it turned out to have a little more to do with our business in Dabaria than I at first thought. The trail that led in the direction of the mines, what Dabaria folk call the salt houses, the workings had been abandoned in those days. It was before the new plug was found 20 years ago. Plug? Jamie asked. Deposit, I said. He means a fresh deposit. Salt? Aye, as you say. But all that were abandoned then, and made a fine hideout for such as those beastly crows. Once the trail left the flats, it went through a place of high rocks before coming out on the low pure, which is to say the foothill meadows, below the salt houses. The low is where a sheep herder was killed just recent, by something that looked like a wolf, I said. This we know. Go on. Well informed, are ye? Well, that's all to the good. Where was I now? Ah, I know. Those rocks that are known in these parts as Ambush Arroyo. It's not an arroyo, but I suppose people like the sound. Arroyo's like a washed-out ditch for when it floods. By the side of the road. Those rocks that are now known in these parts as Ambush Arroyo. It's not an arroyo, but I suppose people like the sound. That's where the tracks went, but Deschane wanted to go around and come in from the east, from the high pure. The sheriff, P. Anderson it was back then, didn't want none of that. Eager as a bird, with its eye on a worm he was, mad to press on, said it would take him 3 days, and by then the woman might be dead and the crows anywhere. He said he was going the straight way, and he'd go alone if no one wanted to go with him. Or unless you order me in the name of Gilead to do different, he says to Arda. Never think it, Deschane says, for Dabaria is your fill. I have my own. The posse went. I stayed with Yuda, lad. Sheriff Anderson turned to me in the saddle and said, I hope they're hiring at one of the ranches, Huey, because your days of wearing tin on your vest are over. I'm done with thee. I don't know what all their beef is. I missed something between the lines. Those were the last words he ever said to me. They rode off. Stephen of Gilead squatted on his hunkers, and I hunkered with him. Oh, I see. After half an hour of quiet, might have been longer, I says to him, I thought we were going to hook around, unless you're done with me too. No, he says. Your hire is not my business, deputy. Then what are we waiting for? Gunfire, says he, and not 5 minutes later we heard it. Gunfire and screams. It didn't last long. The crows had seen us coming, probably no more than a glint of sun on a boot cap or bit of saddle bright work was enough to attract their attention, for Pa Crow has powerful trig, and doubled back. They got up in those high rocks and poured down lead on Anderson and his posse men. There were more guns in those days, and the crows had a good share, even a speed shooter or two. So we went around, all right? Took us only 2 days, because Stephen Deschane pushed hard. On the 3rd day, we camped downslope and rose before dawn. Now, if ye don't know, and no reason ye should, salt houses are just caverns in the cliff faces up there. Whole families lived in them, not just the miners themselves. The tunnels go down into the earth from the backs of them, but as I say, in those days all were deserted, Yet we saw smoke coming from the vent on top of one, and that was as good as a kinkman standing out in front of a carnival tent and pointing at the show inside. Don't you see it? This is the time, Stephen says, because they will have spent the last nights, once they were sure they were safe, deep in drink. They'll still be sleeping it off. Will you stand with me? Aye, gunslinger, that I will, I told him. When Peavy said this, Peavy, I'm getting all mixed up. Oh, P, the other guy was P, the sheriff was P. Anderson, not PV, okay. Aye, gunslinger, that I will, I told him. When Peavy said this, he unconsciously straightened his back. He looked younger. We snuck the last 50 or 60 yards. Your dad with his gun drawn in case they'd posted a guard. They had, but he was only a lad and fast asleep. The desk chain holstered his gun, sworded him with a rock, and laid him out. I later saw that young fellow standing on a trapdoor with tears running out of his eyes, a mess in his pants, and a rope around his neck. He wasn't but 14, yet he'd taken his turn at Cy Doolin, the kidnapped woman, don't you know, and old enough to be his grandmother, just like the rest of them, and I shed no tears when the rope shut off his cries for mercy. The salt ye take is the salt ye must pay for, as anyone from these parts will tell you. The gunslinger crept inside, and I right after him. They was all lying around, snoring like dogs. Hell, boys, they were dogs. Belinda Doolin was tied to a post. She saw us, and her eyes widened. Stephen Deschamps pointed to her, then to himself, then cupped his hands together, then pointed to her again. You're safe, he meant. I never forgot the look of gratitude in her face as she nodded to him that she understood. You're safe. That's the world we grew up in, young men, the one that's almost gone now. Then the desk chain says, Wake up, Allen Crow, unless you'd go into the clearing at the end of the path with your eyes shut. Wake up, y'all. Oh, that's it, y'all. They did. He never meant to try and bring them all in alive. 'Twould have been madness, that I'm sure you must see, but he wouldn't shore them as they slept either. They woke up to varying degrees, but not for long. Stephen drew his gun so fast I never saw his hands move. Lightning ain't in it, dear. At one moment those revolvers with their big sandalwood grips were by his sides. At the next he was blazing away, the noise like thunder in that closed-in space. But that didn't keep me from drawing my own gun. It was just an old barrel shooter I had from my granda, but I put 2 of them down with it. The first 2 men I ever killed. There have been plenty since, sad to say. The only one who survived that first fusillade was Pa Crow himself, Allen Crow. He was an old man, all snarled up and frozen on one side of his face from a stroke or something. But he moved fast as a devil just the same. He was in his long johns, and his gun was stuck in the top of one of his boots there at the end of his bedroll. He grabbed it up and turned toward us. Stephen shot him, and the old bastard got off a single round. It went wild, but Peavy, who could have been no older in those days than we 2 young men standing before him, opened the box on its cunning hinges, mused a moment at what he saw inside, then looked up at me. That little remembering smile still touched the corners of his mouth. Have you ever seen a scar on your father's arm, Roland? Right here? He touched the place just above the crook of his elbow, where a man's yanks begin. Muscles, I guess. My father's body was a map of scars, but it was a map I knew well. The scar above his inner elbow was a deep dimple, almost like the ones not quite hidden by Sheriff Peavy's mustache when he smiled. Pa Crow's last shot hit the wall above the post where the woman was tied and ricocheted. He turned the box and held it out to me. Inside was a smashed slug, a big one, a hard caliber. I dug this out of your da's arm with my skinning knife and gave it to him. He thanked me and said someday I should have it back, and here it is. Ka is a wheel, sighed Chain. Have you ever told this story, I asked, for I have never heard it. That I dug a bullet from the flesh of Arthur's true descendant, Eld of the Eld? No, never until now, for who would believe it? I do, I said, and I thank you. It could have poisoned him. Nar, nar, Peavy said with a chuckle. Not him. The blood of Eld's too strong, and if I'd been laid low, or too squeamy, he would have done it himself. As it was, he let me take most of the credit for the Crow gang, and I've been sheriff ever since. But not much longer. This skin man business has done for me. I've seen enough blood, and I have no taste for mysteries. Who'll take your place? I asked. He seemed surprised by the question. Probably nobody. The mines will play out again in a few years. This time for good, and such rail lines as there are won't last much longer. The two things together will finish Dabaria, which was once a fine little city in the time of your grandfathers. That holy hen coop I'm sure ye passed on the way in may go on. Nothing else. Jamie looked troubled. But in the meantime, let the ranchers, drifters, whoremasters, and gamblers all go to hell in their own way. It's none o' mine, at least for much longer. But I'll not leave until this business is settled, one way or another. I said, the skin man was at one of the women at Serenity. She's badly disfigured. Been there, have ye? The women are terrified. I thought this over and remembered a knife strapped to a calf as thick as the trunk of a young birch. Except for the prioress, that is. He chuckled. Everline. That one spit in the devil's face. And if he took her down to Nis, she'd be running the place in a month. I said, do you have any idea who this skin man might be when he's in this human shape? His human shape. If you do, tell us, I beg. For as my father told your Sheriff Anderson, this is not our Phil. I can't give you a name, if that's what you mean, but I might be able to give you something. Follow me. He led us through the archway behind his desk and into the jail, which was in the shape of a T. I counted 8 big cells down the central aisle, and a dozen small ones on the cross corridor. All were empty except for one of the smaller ones, where a drunk was snoozing away the late afternoon on a straw pallet. The door to his cell stood open. Once all of these cells would have been filled on F-Day and F-Day, Peavy said, loaded up with drunk cowpunchers and farhams. Don't you see it? Now most people stay in at night, even on F-Day and F-Day. Cowpokes in their bunkhouses, farmhands in theirs. No one wants to be staggered home drunk and meet the skin man. The salt miners, Jamie asked? Do you pen them too? Not often, for they have their own saloons up in Little Dabaria. 2 of them. Nasty places. When the whores down here at the Cherry Fellows or the Busted Luck or the Bitterwee get too old or too diseased to attract custom, they end up in Little Dabaria. Once they're drunk on white blind, The Salties don't much care if a whore has a nose as long as she still has her sugar purse. Nice, Jamie muttered. Peavy opened one of the large cells. Come on in here, boys. I haven't any paper, but I do have some chalk, and here's a nice smooth wall. It's private, too, as long as old Salty Sam down there doesn't wake up, and he rarely does until sundown. From the pocket of his twill pants, the sheriff took a goodish stick of chalk, and on the wall he drew a kind of long box, with jags all across the top. They looked like a row of upside-down V's. Here's the whole of Debaria, Peavy said. Over here's the rail line you came in on. He drew a series of hash marks, and as he did so I remembered the Engie and the old fellow who'd served as our butler. Smatu is off the rails, I said. I forgot to. Can you put together a party of men to see it right? We have money to pay for their labor, and Jamie and I would be happy to work with them. Not today, Peavy said absently. He was studying his map. Engie's still out there, is he? Yes, him and another. I'll send Kellen and Vika Fry out in a bucka. Kellen's my best deputy. The other two ain't worth much, and Vika's his son. They'll pick him up and bring him back in before dark. There's time, because the day's in long this time of year. Because the days is long this time of year. For now, just pay attention, boys. Here's the tracks, and here's Serenity, where that poor girl you spoke to was mauled. On the high road, don't you see it? He drew a little box for Serenity and put an X in it. North of the women's retreat, up toward the Jags, at the top of this map, he put another X. This is where Jan Curry, the sheepherder, was killed. To the left of this X, but pretty much on the same level, which is to say, below the Jags, he put another. The Elora farm, 7 killed. Farther yet to the left and a little higher, he chalked another X. Here's the Timbersmith farm on the high pier, 9 killed. It's where we found the little boy's head on a pole, tracks all around it. Wolf? I asked. He shook his head. Yeah, 'cause a wolf wouldn't put... He shook his head. Nar, some kind of big cat, at first, but we lost the trail. They changed into what looked like hooves, then... He looked at us grimly. Footprints. First big, like a giant's almost, but then smaller and smaller, until they were the size of a man's tracks. Anywho, we lost them in the hard pan. Mayhap your father wouldn't have, say. He went on marking the map, and when he was done, stepped away so we could see it clearly. Such as you are supposed to have good brains as well as fast hands, I was always told. So what do you make of this? Jamie stepped forward between the rows of pallets, for this cell must have been for many guests, probably brought in on drunk and disorderly, and traced the tip of his finger over the Jags at the top of the map, blurring them a little. Do the salt houses run all along here, in all the foothills? Yar, the Salt Rocks, those hills are called. Little Debaria is where? Peavy made another box for the salt miners' town. It was close to the X he'd made to mark the place where the woman and the gambler had been killed. For it was Little Debaria they'd been headed for. Jamie studied the map a bit more, then nodded. Looks to me like the skin man could be one of the miners. Is that what you think? Aye, salty, even though a couple of them has been torn up too. It makes sense, as much as anything in a crazy business like this can make sense. The new plug's a lot deeper than the old ones, and everyone knows there are demons in the earth. Everyone knows. Mayhap one of the miners struck on one, wakened it, and was done a mischief by it. There are also leftovers from the great old ones in the ground, I said. Not all are dangerous, but some are. Perhaps one of those old things, those, what do you call them, Jamie? Artifacts, he said. Yes, those. Perhaps one of those is responsible. Mayhap the fellow will be able to tell us if we take him alive. Small chance of that, Peavy growled. I thought there was a good chance. If we could identify him and close on him in the daytime, that was. How many of these salties are there? I asked. Not so many as in the old days, because now it's just the one plug, don't you see it? I should say no more than 200. I met Jamie's eyes and saw a glint of humor in them. No fret, Roland, said he. I'm sure we can interview 'em all by reap tide, if we hurry. He was exaggerating, but I still saw several weeks ahead of us in Debaria. We might interview the skin man and still not be able to pick him out, either because he was a masterful liar or because he had no guilt to cover up. His day self might truly not know what his night self was doing. I wished for Cuthbert, who could look at things that seemed unrelated and spot the connections, and I wished for Elaine, with his power to touch minds. But Jamie wasn't so bad either. He had, after all, seen what I should have seen myself, what was right in front of my nose. On one matter, I was in complete accord with Sheriff Hugh Peavy. I hated mysteries. It's a thing that has never changed in this long life of mine. I'm not good at solving them. My mind has never run that way. When we trooped back into the office, I said, I have some questions I must ask you, Sheriff. The first is, will you open to us if we open to you? The second is, do I see you for what you are and accept what you do? The third is, do I seek aid and succor? Sheriff Peavy says, yar, yar, and yar. Now for God's sake, set your brains to working, fellows, for it's over 2 weeks since this thing showed up at Serenity, and that time it didn't get a full meal. Soon enough it'll be out there again. It only prowls at night, Jamie said. You're sure of that much? I am. Does the moon have any effect on it? I asked. Because my father's advisor, and our teacher that was, says that in some of the old legends. I've heard the legends sigh, but in that they're wrong. At least for this particular creature they are. Sometimes the moon's been full when it strikes. It was full peddler when it showed up at Serenity, all covered with scales and knobs like an alligator from the long salt swamps. But it did its work at Timbersmith when the moon was dark. I'd like to tell you different, but I can't. I'd also like to end this without having to pick anyone else's guts out of the bushes or pluck some other kiddie's head off a fence post. You've been sent here to help, and I hope like hell you can, although I've got my doubts. When I asked Peavy if there was a good hotel or boarding house in Debaria, he chuckled. The last boarding house was the widow Braley's. 2 years ago, a drunk saddle tramp tried to rape her in her own outhouse as she sat at business. But she was always a trig one. She'd seen the look in his eye and went in there with a knife under her apron. Cut his throat for him, she did. Stringy Bodine, who used to be our justice man before he decided to try his luck at raising horses in the Crescent, declared her not guilty by reason of self-defense in about 5 minutes. Oh. But the lady decided she'd had enough of Debaria and trained back to Gilead, where she yet bides. I've no doubt. 2 days after she left, some drunken buffoon burned the place to the ground. The hotel still stands. It's called the Delightful View. The view ain't delightful, young fellows, and the bed's as full of bugs as big as toads' eyeballs. I wouldn't sleep in one without putting on a full suit of Arthur Eld's armor. And so we ended up spending our first night in Debaria, in the large, drunken, disorderly cell, beneath Peavy's chalked map. Salty Sam had been set free, and we had the jail to ourselves. How lovely. Outside, a strong wind had begun to blow off the alkali flats to the west of town. The moaning sound it made around the eaves caused me to think again of the story my mother used to read to me when I was just a small toot myself. The story of Tim Stoutheart and the stark blast Tim had to face in the great woods north of New Canaan. Thinking of the boy alone in those woods has always chilled my heart, just as Tim's bravery has always warmed it. The stories we hear in childhood are the ones we remember all our lives. After one particularly strong gust, the Debaria wind was warm, not cold like the Stark blast. Struck the side of the jail and puffed alkali grit in through the barred window. Jamie spoke up. It was rare for him to start a conversation. I hate that sound, Roland. It's apt to keep me awake all night. I loved it myself. The sound of the wind has always made me think of good times in far places, although I confess I could have done without the grit. How are we supposed to find this thing, Jamie? I hope you have some idea, because I don't. We'll have to talk to the salt miners. That's the place to start. Someone may have seen a fellow with blood on him creeping back to where the Salties live, creeping back naked, for he can't come back clothed unless he takes them off beforehand. That gave me a little hope, although if the one we were looking for knew what it was, he might take his clothes off when he felt an attack coming on, hide them, then come back to them later. But if he didn't know... It was a small thread, but sometimes, if you're careful not to break it, you can pull on a small thread and unravel a whole garment. Good night, Roland. Good night, Jamie. I closed my eyes and thought of my mother. I often did that year, but for once they weren't thoughts of how she had looked dead, but of how beautiful she had been in my early childhood, as she sat beside me on my bed in the room with the colored glass windows, reading to me. Look you, Roland, she'd say. Here are the Billy Bumblers sitting all a row and scenting the air. They know, don't they? Yes, I would say, the Bumblers know. And what is that they know? And what is it they know? The woman I would kill asked me. What is it they know, dear heart? They know the Stark blast is coming, I said. My eyes would be growing heavy by then, and minutes later I would drift off to the music of her voice. As I drifted off now, with the wind outside blowing up a strong gale. I woke in the first thin light of morning to a harsh sound. Brung, brung, brung. Jamie was still flat on his back, legs splayed, snoring. I took one of my revolvers from its holster, went out through the open cell door, and shambled toward that imperious sound. It was the jing-jang Sheriff Peavy had taken so much pride in. He wasn't there to answer it. He'd gone home to bed, and the office was empty. Standing there bare-chested, with a gun in my hand, and wearing nothing but the swabbies and slinkum I'd slept in, for it was hot in the cell, I took the listening cone off the wall, put the narrow end in my ear, and leaned close to the speaking tube. Yes? Hello? Who the hell is this? A voice screamed, so loud that it sent a nail of pain into the side of my head. There were jing-jangs in Gilead, perhaps as many as 100 that still worked, but none spoke so clear as this. I pulled the cone away, wincing, and could still hear the voice coming out of it. "Hello, hello! God's curse this fucking thing, hello?" "I hear you," I said. "Lower thy voice, for your father's sake." "Who is this?" There was just enough drop in volume for me to put the listening cone a little closer to my ear, but not in it. I would not make that mistake twice. "A deputy," is what he says. Some deputy. Jamie Curry and I were the farthest things in the world from that, but simplest is usually best. Always best, I wot, when speaking with the panicky man on a jing-jang. "Where's Sheriff Peavy?" "At home with his wife. It isn't yet 5 o'clock, I reckon. Now tell me who you are, where you're speaking from, and what's happened." "It's Canfield of the Jefferson, Of the Jefferson what?" I heard footsteps behind me and turned, half raising my revolver, but it was only Jamie, with his hair standing up and sleep spikes all over his head. He was holding his own gun and had gotten into his jeans, although his feet were yet bare. "The Jefferson Ranch. Ye great grotting idiot. You need to get the sheriff out here and Gin. Everyone's dead. Jefferson, his family, the cookie, all the Proddies. Proddies. Blood from one end to the other." "How many?" I asked. "Maybe 15, maybe 20. Who can tell?" Canfield of the Jefferson began to sob. "They're all in pieces. Whatever it was did for 'em left the 2 dogs, Rosie and Mosey. They was in there. We had to shoot 'em. They was lapping up the blood and eating the brains." It was a 10-wheel ride, straight north toward the Salt Hills. We went with Sheriff Peavy, Kellen Fry, the good deputy, and Fry's son, Vika. They're supposed to go to help the NG man. The NG, whose name turned out to be Travis, also came along, for he'd spent the night at the Fry's place. We pushed our mounts hard, but it was still full daylight by the time we got to the Jefferson spread. At least the wind, which was still strengthening, was at our backs. Peavy thought Canfield was a pokey, which is to say a wandering cowboy not signed to any particular ranch. Some such turned outlaw, but most were honest enough, just men who couldn't settle down in one place. When we rode through the wide stock gate with Jefferson posted over it in white birch letters, 2 other cowboys, his mates, were with him. The 3 of them were bunched together by the shake-pole fence of the horse corral, which stood near to the big house. A half-mile or so north, standing atop a little hill, was the bunkhouse. From this distance, only 2 things looked out of place. The door at the south end of the bunkie was unlatched, swinging back and forth in the alkali wind, and the bodies of 2 large black dogs lay stretched on the dirt. We dismounted and Sheriff Peavy shook with the men, who looked mightily glad to see us. "Aye, Bill Canfield, see you very well, pokey fella." The tallest of them took off his hat and held it against his shirt. "I ain't no pokey no more. Or maybe I am. I don't know. For a while here I was Canfield of the Jefferson, like I told whoever answered the goddamn speaky, because I signed on just last month. Old man Jefferson himself oversaw my mark on the wall, but now he's dead like the rest of 'em." He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed up and down. The stubble on his face looked very black, because his skin was very white. There was drying vomit on the front of his shirt. "His wife and daughters have gone into the clearing, too. You can tell them by their long hair and their man, Jesus, you see a thing like that and it makes you wish you were born blind. He raised his hat to his face to hide it and began to weep. One of the Cansfield's mates said, "Is those gunslingers, Sheriff? Mighty young to be hauling iron, ain't they?" "Never mind them," said Peavy. "Tell me what brought you here." Canfield lowered his hat. His eyes were red and streaming. "The three of us was camped out on the pier. Rounding strays we were, and camped for the night. Then we heard screaming start from the east. Woke us from a sound sleep, because we was that tired. Then gunshots, 2 or 3 of 'em. They quit and there was more screaming, and something big, roaring and snarling." One of the others said, "It sounded like a bear." "No, it didn't," said the third. "Never at all." Canfield said, "Knew it was coming from the ranch, whatever it was. Had to have been 4 wheels from where we were, maybe 6, but sound carries on the pier, as you know. We mounted up, but I got here way ahead of these 2, because I was signed and they're yet pokies." "I don't understand," I said. Canfield turned to me. "I had a ranch horse, didn't I? A good 'un. Snip and R in there had nothing but mules. Put 'em in there with the others." He pointed into the corral. A big gust of wind blew through just then, driving dust before it, and all the livestock galloped away like a wave. "They're so spooked," Kellen Frey said, looking toward the bunkhouse. "The NG," Travis said. "They ain't the only ones." Forget what an NG is. Conductor? I don't know. By the time Canfield, the Jefferson Ranch's newest proddy, which is to say hired hand, reached the home place, the screaming had stopped. So had the roaring of the beast, although there was still a good deal of snarling going on. That was the 2 dogs, fighting over the leavings. Knowing which side of the biscuit this honey went on. Ooh. Canfield by... It's weird to throw something so delicious into this scene. How bizarre. Canfield bypassed the bunkhouse, and the dogs, snarling within, for the big house. The front door was wide open, and there were lit centers in both the hall and the kitchen. But no one answered his hail. He found Jefferson's lady sign in the kitchen with her body under the table and her half-eaten head rolled up against the pantry door. There were tracks going out the stoop door, which was banging in the wind. Some were human, some were the tracks of a monstrous great bear. The bear tracks were bloody. I took the center off the sink side where it had been left and followed the tracks outside. Kerosene. The 2 girls was laying in the dirt between the house and the barn. One had gotten 3 or 4 dozen running steps ahead of her sissa, but they were both just as dead, with their nightdresses tore off them and their backs carved open right down to the spines. Canfield shook his head slowly from side to side. His large eyes, swimming with tears they were, never leaving High Sheriff Peavy's face. Looking at him. Canfield shook his head slowly from side to side. His large eyes, swimming with tears they were, never leaving High Sheriff Peavy's face. "I never want to see the claws that could do a thing like that. Never, never, never in my life. I seen what they done, and that's enough." "The bunkhouse?" Peavy asked. There I went next. You can see what's inside for yourself. The woman folk, too, and they're still where I found 'em. I won't take ye. Snip and Arn might. Not me, said Snip. Me neither, said Arn. I'll see an all in my dreams, and that'll do me fine. I don't think we need a guide, Peavy said. You three boys stay right here. Sheriff Peavy, closely followed by the Frys and Travis the Ng, started toward the big house. Jamie put a hand on Peavy's shoulder and spoke almost apologetically when the High Sheriff turned to look at him. Mind the tracks. They'll be important. Peavy nodded. Yar, we'll mind 'em very well, especially those headed off to wherever the thing went. The women were as Cy Canfield had told us. I had seen bloodshed before, plenty of it, both in Magis and in Gilead, but I had never seen anything like this, and neither had Jamie. He was as pale as Canfield, and I could only hope he would not discredit his father by passing out. I needn't have worried. Soon he was down on his knees in the kitchen, examining several enormous blood-rimmed animal tracks. These really are bear tracks, he said, but there was never one so big, Roland, not even in the endless forest. There was one here last night, Cully, Travis said. He looked toward the body of the rancher's wife and shivered, even though she, like her unfortunate daughters, had been covered with blankets from upstairs. I'll be glad to get back to Gilead, where such things are just legends. That's what Travis said. Travis the Ng. What do the tracks tell otherwise? I asked Jamie. Anything? Yes. It went to the bunkhouse first, where the most food was. The rumpus would have wakened the four of them here in the house. Were there only four, Sheriff? Aye, Peavy said. There are 2 sons, but Jefferson would have sent 'em to the auctions in Gilead, I expect. They'll find a sack of woe when they return. The rancher left his womenfolk and went running for the bunkhouse. The gun Canfield and his mates heard must have been his. Much good it did him, Vicar Frey said. His father hit him on the shoulder and told him to hush. Then the thing came up here, Jamie went on. The lady Cy Jefferson and the 2 girls were in the kitchen by then, I think. And I think the Cy must have told her daughters to run. Aye, Peavy said, and she'd try to keep it from coming after them long enough for them to get away. That's how it reads. Only it didn't work. If they'd been at the front of the house, if they'd seen how big it was, she'd have known better, and we would have found all 3 of 'em out there in the dirt. He fetched a deep sigh. Come on, boys. Let's see what's in the bunkhouse. Waiting won't make it any prettier. I think I might just stay out by the corral with those saddle tramps, Travis said. I've seen enough. Vicar Fry blurted out, Can I do that too, Pa? Kellen looked at his son's haunted face and said he could. Before he let the boy go, he put a kiss on his cheek. 10 feet or so in front of the bunkhouse, the bare earth had been scuffed into a bloody churn of boot prints and clawed animal tracks. Nearby, in a clump of jugweed, was an old short-arm 4-shot with its barrel bent to one side. Jamie pointed from the confusion of tracks to the gun, to the open bunkhouse door. Then he raised his eyebrows, silently asking me if I saw it. I saw it very well. This is where the skin man wearing the shape of a bear, met the rancher, I said. He got off a few rounds, then dropped the gun. No, Jamie said. The thing took it from him. That's why the barrel's bent. Maybe Jefferson turned to run. Maybe he stood his ground. Either way, it did no good. His tracks stopped here, so the thing picked him up and threw him through that door and into the bunkhouse. It went to the big house next. So we're backtracking it, Peavy said. Jamie nodded. We'll front track it soon enough, he said. The thing had turned the bunkhouse into an abattoir. Abattoir. In the end, the butcher's bill came to 18. 16 proddies, the cook, who had died beside his stove with his rent and blood-stained apron thrown over his face like a shroud, and Jefferson himself, who had been torn limbless. His severed head stared up at the rafters with a fearful grin that showed only his top teeth. The skin man had ripped the rancher's lower jaw right out of his mouth. Kellen Fry found it under a bunk. One of the men had tried to defend himself with a saddle, using it as a shield, but it had done him no good. The thing had torn it in half with its claws. The unfortunate cowboy was still holding on to the pommel with one hand. He had no face. The thing had eaten it off his skull. Bath salts. Roland, Jamie said. His voice was strangled, as if his throat had closed up to no more than a straw. We have to find this thing. We have to. Could be a chimpanzee. Let's see what the outward tracks say before the wind wipes them out, I replied. We left Peavy and the others outside the bunkhouse and circled the big house to where the covered bodies of the two girls lay. The tracks beyond them had begun to blur at the edges and around the claw points, but they would have been hard to miss even for someone not fortunate enough to have had Court of Gilead as a teacher. The thing that made them must have weighed upwards of 800 pounds. Look here, Jamie said, kneeling beside one. See how it's deeper at the front? It was running. And on its hind legs, I said, like a man. The tracks went past the pump house, which was in shambles, as if the thing had given it a swipe out of pure malice as it went by. They led us onto an uphill lane that headed north, toward a long, unpainted outbuilding that was either a tack shed or a smithy. Beyond this, perhaps 20 wheels further north, sounds like a lot, were the rocky badlands below the salt hills. We could see the holes that led to the worked-out mines. They gaped like empty eye sockets. We may as well give this up, I said. We know where the tracks go. Up to where the Salties live. Not yet, Jamie said. Look here, Roland. You've never seen anything like this. The tracks began to change, the claws merging into the curved shapes of large, unshod hooves. It's lost its bear shape, I said, and become, what, a bull? I think so, Jamie said. Let's go a little farther. I have an idea. Sitting, my goodness. Sitting. Oh, sitting sucks. As we approached the long outbuilding, the hoof prints became paw prints. Too close. I still want to talk out. So funny. The hoof prints became paw prints. The bull had become some kind of monstrous cat. These tracks were large at first, then started to grow smaller, as if the thing were shrinking from the size of a lion to that of a cougar, even as it ran. When they veered off the lane and onto the dirt path leading to the tack shed, we found a large patch of jugweed grass that had been beaten down. The broken stalks were bloody. It fell, Jamie said, I think it fell and then thrashed. He looked up from the bed of matted weed. His face was thoughtful. I think it was in pain. Good, I said. Now look there. I pointed to the path, which was imprinted with the hooves of many horses, and other signs as well. Bare feet going to the doors of the building, which were run back on rusty metal tracks. Jamie turned to me, wide-eyed. I put my finger to my lips and drew one of my revolvers. Jamie did likewise. And we moved toward the shed. I waved him around to the far side. He nodded and split off to the left. I stood outside the open doors, gun held up, giving Jamie time to get to the other end of the building. I heard nothing. When I judged my pard must be in place, I bent down, picked up a good-sized stone with my free hand, and tossed it inside. It thumped, then rolled across wood. There was still nothing else to hear. I swung inside, crouched low, gun at the ready. The place seemed empty, but there were so many shadows, it was at first hard to tell for sure. It was already warm, and by noonday would be an oven. I saw a pair of empty stalls on either side, a little smithy stove next to drawers full of rusty shoes and equally rusty shoe nails, dust-covered jugs of liniment and stinkum, branding irons in a tin sleeve, and a large pile of old tack that needed either to be mended or thrown out. Above a couple of benches hung a fair assortment of tools on pegs. Most were as rusty as the shoes and nails, so the salt. There were a few wooden hitching hooks and a pedestal pump over a cement trough. The water in the trough hadn't been changed for a while. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I could see bits of straw floating on the surface. I kenned that this had once been more than a tack shed. It had also been a kind of hostelry where the ranch's working stock was seen to. Likely a jack-leg veterinary as well. Horses could be let in at one end, dealt with, and let out the other. But it looked in disrepair, abandoned. The tracks of a thing that had by then been human led up the center aisle to other doors, also open at the far end. I followed them. Jamie, it's me. Don't shoot. For your father's sake. I stepped outside. Jamie had holstered his gun and now pointed at a large heap of horse apples. He knows what he is, Roland. You know this from a pile of horse shit? As it happens, I do. He didn't tell me how, but after a few seconds, I saw it for myself. The hostelry had been abandoned, probably in favor of one built closer in to the main house. But the horse apples were fresh. If he came a horseback, he came as a man. Aye, and left as one. I squatted on my hunkers and thought about this. Jamie rolled a smoke at me. Well, when I looked up, he was smiling a little. Do you see what it means, Roland? 200 salties, give or take, I said. I've ever been slow, but in the end, I usually get there. He just thought that to himself. Aye, salties, mind, not pokies or proddies, diggers, not riders, as a rule. As you say. How many of 'em up here have horses? Up there have horses, do you suppose? How many even know how to ride? His smile broadened. There might be 20 or 30, I suppose. It's better than 200, I said. Better by a long stride. We'll go up as soon as... I never finished what I was going to say, because that's when the moaning started. It was coming from the tack shed I dismissed as empty. How glad I was at that moment Court wasn't there. He would have cuffed my ear and sent me sprawling. At least in his prime he would have. Jamie and I looked into each other's startled eyes, then ran back inside. The moaning continued, but the place looked as empty as before. Then that big heap of old tack, busted hames, bridles, cinch straps, and reins, started to heave up and down as if it were breathing. The tangled bunches of leather began to tumble away to either side, and from them a boy was born. His white blonde hair was sticking up in all directions. He wore jeans and an old shirt that hung open and unbuttoned. He didn't look hurt, but in the shadows it was hard to tell. "Is it gone?" he asked in a trembling voice. "Please, Si, say it is. Say it's gone." "It is," I said. He started to wade his way out of the pile, but a strip of leather had gotten wound around one of his legs and he fell forward. I caught him and saw a pair of eyes, bright blue and utterly terrified, looking up into my face. Then he passed out.